Thank you. And so first, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm David Jennings. I'm out of Olympia. I have a background in wildlife ecology and biostatistics. I've been a strong conservationist since I was in like 6th grade when they asked me to play Captain Ecology in a video or something. So I'm a little caught off. It's been an interesting morning for me, so I'm fumbling just a little bit. What I'm going to be talking about today are the bumblebees of Washington. I've been looking at bumblebees in Washington for about 5 or 6 years. About 6 years ago, my local Audubon chapter had a little article in the newsletter that said the Xerces Society, which is a nonprofit devoted to invertebrate conservation, had just launched a new program called Bumblebee Watch. I've always been interested in bumblebees, or at least, since the early 90s, but I got very frustrated trying to figure out what species I was looking at. I am a bit of a lister, birds, fish, frogs, turtles, you name it, I like to identify them. Not very good with plants, but if it moves other than by wind, I try and figure out what it is. But the Bumblebee Watch said, if you take a picture of the bumblebee and turn it into us, it'll be good citizen science, but we'll also tell you what bee you're looking at. And so that was really an eye-opener for me to be able to go out, photograph bumblebees, and then get information on what species they were. So I've been doing that a lot these past 2 years. So why is this not? So I really enjoyed this picture when I caught it, 2 different species on the same flower. The bumblebee on the left is saying, oh, hey, what's going on this morning? And then, so I thought it was just sort of a nice, fun interaction. And then one of my sort of more knowledgeable bee biologist friends said, actually, David, raising the middle leg by a bee is kind of like raising the middle finger by us. It's a sign of irritation. And so now I look at this picture and realize that bumblebee is really irritated that this, who is this upstart butterfly to come in and start taking the nectar that I've been wanting to get. So I just thought that was kind of a fun interpretation of behavior. While I'm looking at this bee, I just wanted to talk a couple things about why we know it's a bee. So you can see it's got these long, straight antennae. That's very characteristic. It often has a black patch between the wings, a color up front and behind. If you notice, and this isn't a great picture, but this is a fairly bright yellow or yellowish, whereas this part you can see has more dark hairs in it. So this is called cloudy. And really, not really. We also look at the abdomen for identification. So in this case, it's got abdominal segments. And we're looking at T1, T2, T3, T4. T1 is yellow, T2 and T3 are red, and T4 looks black with some white on it. We'll talk about all that later. I'm just sort of giving you a visual for how you know it might be a bumblebee when you're looking at it. Also, right down here, you can see it's starting to build that big patch of pollen basket to take back home to feed its young. Who am I to talk about bumblebees? Well, this is the Bumblebee Watch website. I came across this a couple of weeks ago when I was working on this talk. Turns out that this is me, David Jennings. Of all the people in North America who participate, Rich Hatfield runs the program and he's seen 31 species in the field, and I've seen 26, most of which are in Washington. And I submitted about just under 500 observations that are the basis for the talk you're going to see. So I've been doing my best to put in pay my dues in the field. What I'd like to talk about is just pollination overview. If I forget, please ask me about buzz pollination. A little quick overview about bumblebee biology to put it in perspective. And then a lot of discussion around how to identify bumblebees in your backyard. Last summer, I didn't do much field work, so I took the opportunity to build a website. Never had done that. This is my first one. We'll walk through how to use it to identify common species we come across. We'll wrap up with a little bit of conservation discussion and then happy to answer any questions. No work is done by, or projects are rarely done by one person. I've had a lot of help over the last several years. James Halleck's a friend of mine who did a lot of data analysis with me to figure out how to use pivot tables to display some of the GIS data we had. And at the very bottom of the list, my wife, Jan's really good about letting me run around the field and not do the chores on the weekend. So I want to thank her very much. Why am I focusing on bumblebees? There's a big conservation concern for all of our native pollinators. But within the native pollinator community, bumblebees is sort of the glamorous megafauna. Everybody knows bumblebees. For the most part, everybody likes bumblebees. And they're not like wasps that sting everybody. The nice thing from a conservation perspective is that they're generalists. They have the queen comes out this time of year. She starts a colony. The colony stays active throughout the entire summer. And then she lets, then new queens come out, they get fertilized, they go underground for the winter and start again. So if you're providing habitat for a bumblebee community, you're going to be providing plants and shelter across the entire summer. And by doing that, you'll provide a lot of habitat for other native species as well, other native pollinators. One thing I really like about working with pollinators is that we can make a big difference as individuals. I do a lot of conservation efforts, old growth, rockfish conservation, people are in the climate change, preventing climate change, saving the polar bears. A lot of those conservation efforts are very large scale, and it's really hard to see what you as an individual, what your contribution does. When you're working with pollinators in your backyard, you see it right away. You improve the quality of the habitat for them, and you will see them show up. It's kind of like that movie. If you build it, they will come. One of the main messages I'd like you guys to walk away with is pollinators are really important, and I'm hoping that you'll learn them, respect them, and then do your best to protect them moving forward. Selfishly, tracking bumblebees has really given me an opportunity to run all over the state of Washington. This is up in the northeast corner near Mount Salmo and about a mile from Canada and a mile from Idaho. Also been down in the southeast corner up near Nia Bay, up near the Canadian border in Blaine, down near Vancouver, Washington, in the center of the state. It's just been a really good opportunity to explore and really appreciate the diversity of habitats we have. I've been talking about pollinators, and I just want to make sure we all know what we're talking about. A main reason that they're so important is that they are keystone species. That's an ecological term that came out of the University of Washington about 25 years ago when they were studying the intertidal zone out on the outer coast, which is, if you've been there, swept by the waves, high tide is buried, low tide it's not. But if you look at the rocks that are exposed, they're just covered with a high diversity of different species. The scientists were doing experiments, and so they removed one species called an ochre star, which is a starfish. And what they found was by removing that one species and waiting time over time, that entire ecosystem changed to a monoculture of mussels. So they recognized that one species, the starfish, really kept the ecosystem the way it was. And by removing that one species, it would change drastically. So they came up with the concept of a keystone species. Well, that fits right into pollination. Pollination is the exchange of genetic material, pollen, between plants. And they do that to get pollen to get successful fertilization. Flowering plants require pollination to reproduce in an ideal way. Some can self-pollinate, but oftentimes the seed set is less, the fruit is smaller, So for the most best outcome, cross-pollination on plants is best. About 15% of plants that are flowering plants use wind or other sort of mechanical methods to pollinate. And we see that this time of year with the pine trees. They're dropping all the large amounts of yellow pollen, at least in Olympia. Ragweed in the summertime, all the grasses put out that pollen. But 85% of plants, plus or minus, use animals to transfer that pollen. And it's not just the plants that need pollination. When you think about it, all of fauna, the animals that we like, benefit too. They eat the berries, the seeds, the nuts. They browse the new growth that happens when you have a new plant. So pollination is really important for the entire ecosystem, that plant and animal community, to stay the way it is. A lot of different species pollinate worldwide. We've seen bats do it on cactus, hummingbirds, a lot of different insects. Moths turn out to be pretty important at night. But the star of the show are native bees. And there's two reasons why native bees are such important pollinators. One, they deliberately, for their own reason, not to help the flower, but they deliberately transport pollen between flowers, which fits right into the other behavior called constancy, which is they transport pollen between flowers of the same species. So if you're a flower wanting to get pollinated or wanting to make sure that your pollen goes to the right place, native bees are the way to go, because they'll collect pollen from you and they will go to a flower of the same type. So the probability that they will help you successfully have pollination is so much higher than wasps and bees and butterflies that just sort of flip from flower to flower, but not necessarily the same species and not necessarily collecting pollen to take with them. You can see that behavior in a bumblebee. So this is the pollen that they've collected. And what you see is that pollen is all one color. That implies that pollen all came from the same species of flower. And if they're out there collecting and they can't find enough, they will switch to a new flower. But what you see is, in this case, this bee was collecting this from this flower. She could not find any more. So she switched to the next species, but she only went to one other species. So again, from the plant's perspective, this is very helpful to ensure pollination. Switching gears, talking about bumblebees' behavior. Unlike a lot of insects, they are totally vegan. They only eat pollen and nectar. They only, for the most part, eat pollen and nectar that the flower wants to give them. That's true for both the adults and the larvae. A lot of other species, wasps, for example, you might see them on flowers eating pollen and nectar, but they're going to be catching the spiders or whatever to go back and feed their young meat. Bumblebees have colonies, therefore they're social animals. This time of year, the queen comes out after hibernating. She feeds, she looks for a good place to start her colony. She starts laying eggs. I've seen a few workers here in Olympia now. Within a bumblebee colony, there's a queen, only one, a lot of workers, and then drones, which is another word for males. Between the workers, there is role separation. Small ones often stay in the nest and help take care of the larvae. Larger ones may go, are more likely to go get pollen and nectar. It's a fairly scary thing to do. And or as a bee is young, it'll be a pollen collector, but as it gets older, it may stay back and help raise the young. So role separation. What I found really amazing on bumblebees is there's one of a few species that actually raise their internal temperature. They can raise their temperature 30 degrees or more Fahrenheit above background. So I've seen them flying in 39-degree weather. I've seen them flying in 42-degree weather in light rain. and most insects can't do that. So this really gives them a competitive advantage for high altitudes and high latitudes. So as it turns out, Washington State is a bumblebee biodiversity hotspot. We've got over half the known species of bumblebees in North America occurring here in Washington. I talk about queens and workers. They're both females. Queens are fertile females who can lay eggs. For the most part, the difference is size. So the bee on the left is a worker. You can see the pollen basket on one of her legs, actually on both of them. One of them's kind of hidden. But the queen is on the right. And from a mass perspective, the queen is maybe 4 to 6 times larger. So you see the queens now, they're big. They really need that size because they're going to be laying a lot of eggs, but also they have to have enough resources to be able to store those resources, eat a lot, and then hibernate all winter long to come back out. When we look at what a colony does during the summer, from what we see as we are looking in the field, this time of year, we're getting the queens coming out and they're starting. And once they get enough food and find a place to start their colony, they lay eggs, and we start seeing many fewer queens and a lot more workers. Depending on the colony, early on to middle of the season, they'll start producing males. And then, so you'll see males as well as workers in the field. And then later, near the end of the season, you start seeing new queens for next year. And this looks like a lot smaller number than these, but that's because it's based on a number of observations. But if you look at how much energy it took to put together that queen, it's so much more energy than it is to produce a worker or a drone, that really this level from an energy perspective and a resource is just about as big as these two. I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at this. If you're into bumblebees, you might want to take a screenshot. These are the bumblebees we have in Washington, and I've tried to group them. The group 1 is sort of the more common ones you should know if you live on the west side. The section 2 are the basics ones that you want to start with living on the east side. Group 3 are the ones that you can find if you look for, but they can be found. They're just not all that widely distributed. Group 4, it's much more random for you to find them, or you really have to know where to look. The cuckoos are very uncommon, and the others, while they have a fairly wide distribution, their habitats become so fragmented that you just don't necessarily come across them when you're walking around in the field looking. Group 5 are the high altitude bumblebees above 5,000 or 6,000 feet in the Olympics, the Cascades, Mount Rainier. And then the bottom 2 may well be extirpated from Washington. We haven't seen them in about 10 years, Morrison's and the cyclic cuckoo. So a lot of this talk is going to be focused on how do we identify bees. And when I started off as a sort of a vertebrate biologist, mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, and let me drop the fish. So all those vertebrates, for the most part, look the same. A tiger looks like a tiger, looks like a tiger, does not look like a lion. Most birds, you can tell what they are by looking at them, and they don't change colors. But for bumblebees, a given species may have a lot of different color variations. And between species, they tend to look alike in the same area because they're reinforcing each other's message that don't bother me, I can sting you if you do. So there's some benefit to sort of co-evolve a similar appearance in a given area. So this was really confusing to me. It took me like several years to figure out what I was looking for and how to identify it. But as I started doing it, it turned out to be a little bit easier. So when you're in the field and you're gonna identify a bumblebee, there's just a series of questions you ask. Is it a bumblebee? And we'll talk about how you know. Is it a queen or worker? And the main reason there is a lot of drones, males, look like queens or workers, but a few species, the male drone can look a lot different. So queen or worker just means you're much more likely to be able to identify it easily. Once you figure out it's a bumblebee and it's a queen or worker, then you just look at the color patterns: white, red, striped, black, rear, or yellow. And you kind of go through it in that order. So this is the website. I'm hoping people can see it. It covers about 26 different species. There's an overview of how to do field identification. We're going to come back to the body parts. And then there's some resources about how to interpret the range maps, resources to look up on the internet, and some field techniques for people that want to catch bumblebees for a closer look. What I've done with this website is to make it so you can identify the bumblebees by color. A lot of the other guides you find are looking at the cheek length or the mouth part size or something, and it just gets very hard. And for me, I don't really want to catch a lot of bumblebees. I just soon take their picture and figure it out and be more a passive observer than directly interacting with them. So we've come up with this ID by color approach. And again, same questions as before. Is it a bumblebee? Is it a female? And then it asks some questions about color. So if you don't, so as a starting place, you can come back here and use this. We actually have a dichotomous key, which is a series of questions that helps you, sorry, wrong button. That walks you through very specific questions that will end up telling you what we think the species is. We do have some information on gardening for bumblebees and native bee conservation, who we are, some information. So let me get back to using this. So I thought I'd start by just having us as a group sort of talk about how do you identify these. And these are the first two bumblebees we want to identify. So there are two different species. When I look at them, this one has clear white at the tail. And I say white because in this instance, the white contrasts strongly with the yellow. So you have, there's no, is it white, is it yellow? You have a contrast between the two. Same's true on this species. It has a white front, white in front of the wings, but the abdomen is sort of a golden yellow. So I would say that when we look at the colors, it's white. So we can come here, bumblebee showing white. And in Washington, we only have two that fit this category, the Western bumblebee and the white-shouldered bumblebee. So depending on the species you saw, again, this has the yellow in front and the white tail. So one of the ones we were just looking at is a Western bumblebee. And the other one is that white-shouldered bumblebee with the white up front and the yellow abdomen. If you think that's the species, then you can just come and click on the individual species page, and it'll walk you through a lot more information about that one species, where it's been seen around the state, some field ID tips to help you identify it, other similar species if there are any. So two species, and both of these are found on the west, on the east side and the west side. They're more common on the east side where you guys are. And in particular, the Western bumblebee, the one on the left with the white tail, is a species of conservation concern. It was affected by an outbreak of disease brought over by bumblebee queens that have been raised in Europe to be placed into tomato greenhouses for buzz pollination. And workers got out into the environment and they came bearing a host of diseases, one of which seems to have really impacted the Western bumblebee. So if you see it, we'd love to have a picture taken and you submit it to either iNaturalist or Bumblebee Watch so we can capture the information through a citizen science perspective. Next bumblebee to talk about identifying is this one. So when I look at it, it looks like it's yellow up front. It does show red on the abdomen. So, and then with a little bit of black. So T1, T2, T3, T4, T5. I'm going to jump back and talk about how to use this site, Bumblebee Parts. So here's a reference to what we're talking about. The head, the face color can be yellow or black. Thorax has 3 parts over the center, which may have a black area or may not in this case. The front is called the scutum. The back is called the scutellum. As we talked about, if the scutum, and this one doesn't, if the scutum had some black hairs in with it, it turns into something we call cloudy. So cloudy just means it has black hairs mixed in with the yellow. We're talking about the abdomen being the segments T1, T2, T3, T4, T5. I would describe this as T1 and T4, and maybe T5 being yellow and T2 and T3 being red. So we go back to this, we see it's yellow, yellow, and then yellow T1, T2, T3, and T4 are red. T5 is black. So bumblebees by color shows red on the abdomen. It's red on the abdomen, but it's in the middle, right? So if you weren't sure of what that means, you can come here and see, is it in the middle or is it at the end? In our case, it was in the middle. So then you can come to the groups called red in the middle. There's a whole host of bumblebees that fit this description. And some of them look somewhat similar to each other. So if it's hard to look at what the species you have and say, oh, based on this picture, I can guess. Instead, you can say, okay, it is a bumblebee. It has red in the center. So now I'm going to come to this dichotomous key. And rather than having to go through the whole key, which is good to do for the first couple of times, you can come to that, you can click here to go to the section that only deals with bumblebees showing red on middle of the abdomen. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to click here, takes us down into the key, red in the middle. If you had a question about the sputum, you can click and it'll take you back to the pictures. If you have a question about what T4 means, it'll take you back and same thing and show you the body parts. But right off the bat, we look at the first couplet of questions. Sputum, yellow, yes. T1 and T2, yellow, yes. T3 and T4, red or orange, yes. T5, black. So that says, gets you to an ID, and the ID is for the central bumblebee. This is a common east side bumblebee. Or I won't say it's common, but it's definitely an east side bumblebee. It's rarely found on the west side. One thing about these numbers that's much more helpful to say where have they been seen as opposed to how many have been seen, because Palouse Hills has a big number seen, but that doesn't mean that you're much more likely to see one if you go to Palouse Hills. It means that Palouse Hills is the ecoregion, the habitat that also has Washington State University and their entomology program and decades of students doing insect collections. So this is more of a sampling bias than it is a abundance indicator. Next bumblebee to walk through is this one. It's a large body size. It's one of my favorites because it's so large. Oh wait, is that one there? I'm not sure. You look at it, I don't see a lot of white. That's all the same color. I don't see red. It's not really striped. It's all sort of that solid yellow and then black. So it has a black rear. So this would be the black rear group. So you come up here, bumblebees by color, black rear of abdomen, black rear of abdomen. Now for these, there are a few, but they look pretty distinctly different. So it's clearly not that one. Oh wait, could it be this one? It certainly looks like it could be golden all the way across, a big black dot and a black rear. This one doesn't have that same golden, it's much over yellow. This has a brown here. This is a brown belted. And this one only has yellow on the first of the abdominal segments. So really looking at the group, it looks like it's going to be the Nevada Bumblebee. So if you thought that was the one, you can come here and click on Nevada and get a much better sense of, yes, that looks like the one we just saw. Here's some tips. Here's some other pictures, some species that may be similar to rule them out. And here's some details to look at. Where it's been seen in Washington. And then sort of the last species is a fairly common one, so it's a really good one to recognize. Sorry. It is not white because it's not white and yellow. It's not one of the two we looked at. We're not really seeing a lot of red. There might be a hint of red in a couple places. Doesn't really have a black rear, striped before. So this would be one of the striped group. No red, yes, stripes. The key will actually work if you said it had red, but no red isn't. The red's so fairly minor on these. So you kind of the overall group, many fewer individuals to compare against. This one looks like it could be it. Got that black here. Same species. Clearly not this one with that black face and that very black body. Not this one with all the black and no yellow here. Same. And this one has too much yellow. So if you're just looking at pictures, this first one looks like it could be a good choice. Let me jump back and talk about Bumblebee Parts for a second. So Bumblebee Parts. So one of the things you look at that's really characteristic for some species is what we call the black inverted triangle on the back end of the thorax. So it's this long, skinny black line that comes down. So when you look at the bumblebee that we're looking at in question, you can see it's got this black triangle here. You can see the black triangle coming down here. You can see the black triangle coming down here. And this picture is blocked for me because of the presentation. Oh wait, you can't really see it there. So it's got that sort of black inverted triangle. It also shows T1 as yellow. Here's T1, T2 and T3 are black, and T4 is yellow. So it's T1 yellow, T2, T3 black, T4 yellow with a black triangle. So what we see, there's the black triangle, there's T4, and if you look at it from the side, you can see it has T1 yellow, T2 and T3 black, and T4 yellow. So what we're looking at here is the two-form bumblebee. It's actually was the two-form bumblebee. It was Bombus bifarius, but the taxonomists this past summer split this large species into two species. So now it's more correctly known as the Vancouver bumblebee because of the divisions that just happened. Real key is this black triangle on the abdomen, on the thorax pointing at the abdomen. That'll really jump out at you when you start looking at these bees, and they really help you separate them from things like the red belted Bombus rufus inctus. So we've just walked through sort of how to use the website to identify bumblebees. I'd love for you guys to use it and give me feedback about problems or issues. It's the first website I built and I pulled this together, but without feedback, it's hard for me to make it better. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about bee conservation concerns. Because like a lot of other species, bees are in steep decline all over the place. But what's really important to understand is that their role as keystone species. So if the bees disappear, we don't get the plants pollinated. Plants not being pollinated means that they don't reproduce as well, so they decline. So it's this sort of negative feedback where then you have fewer flowers to support the bees that are left, bees are declining, fewer flowers, and all the other species that are dependent on that flower community, that plant community, starts to weaken also. For the most part, we don't know anything about the bee species in the United States. We actually don't even know all the species of native bees in Washington State. We're trying to do our best to get that information now. We understand bumblebees, but not so much all the other species. But when you look at the big picture, it's not good at all. And it's not restricted. These declines are not just associated with bees, there are also other pollinators like butterflies. And this article came out just this year. Really, the takeaway message is this headline right here. People have been looking, identifying, and tracking bees for quite a few years. But since the 90s, many more people have started looking at them, and the tools we have to identify them and capture the images are so much better. Smartphones, digital phones. But when people look at the data of all the bees that have been seen, a quarter of them have not been seen since 1990, even though we have many more people able to capture many more encounters, which really sort of does, it makes you realize how quickly these species are disappearing on the landscape. We did a similar study here in Washington, or here in the United States, same things, half the species were declining, a fourth looked like they were on the way to extinction. And again, when you recognize pollinators and bees and the role they play with pollination, it's a really scary finding. It's not just bees, these are butterflies. This came out this summer or this winter, a study that pointed out that of the 450 butterfly species they tracked in the United States on the western part of the US, they've been declining every year for the last 40. And Western populations of monarchs have dropped by 99%. So we're looking at a really scary time. I just graphed this out so you can sort of understand better what a decline of 1.6% per year looks like over the 40 years of the studies. So if you start off at 100% or 100 individuals in the field, now you'd be approaching about 55 that you'd encounter. So it's a pretty big reduction, and the trend doesn't seem to be improving at all. Bees are important to people, even if you don't worry too much about the ecosystem and the rest of the fauna, because bees, pollination is important for us. We think about honeybees, but actually native bees do a lot of the pollination of our food plants. So if you are worried about food production for us, you need to be worried about bees. And Washington State was identified in this study as one of the high-risk states for the dependency on native bees for our crops. A lot of different reasons that bees are declining. Global warming, and that's sort of one of the big factors for the honeybee or for the butterflies. Habitat loss and habitat degradation. You guys know that well on the east side with this shrub steppe being taken over by the cheatgrass and the cheatgrass burning and really degrading the habitat. So it might still be non-agricultural, but it's not the quality diverse habitat it had been. We have invasive species like cheatgrass. Honeybees actually sort of fall into that category also. They compete directly with our native species. We have a lot of pesticide problems, and neonicotinoids were thought to be a godsend back in the 90s when they got rolled out, because prior to that point, the pesticides used on agricultural crops were very dangerous for the people who were applying them, and neonicotinoids are much safer for people. So there was a big push to get neonicotinoids approved, but what they didn't realize that these compounds, while they might not kill the bees directly, and that's all that these studies looked at, what's the lethal dose to kill half the bees exposed to it, and they only look at the honeybees. What they're finding now, both here and in Europe, is that it really changes the behavior. It actually makes the bees sort of intoxicated, a little drunk or stoned or something. They don't fly as well, they don't stay focused. And at the colony level, the colony doesn't thrive and often doesn't put out queens the next year. So, and the neonicotinoids are persistent, they're systemic, they get into the soil and they stay there, and you put them on the seeds and they end up being in the pollen and the nectar when the plant's an adult. And then we're seeing pathogens coming in from commercially raised bees for tomato plants. But I don't really want to talk about all that, because the good news is for pollinators and for bees, as individuals, we can make a big difference. In your yard, starting to recognize having plants from early spring through the fall for nectar and pollen sources. Native plants are best. A lot of the commercial varieties have been chosen to look pretty, but not necessarily to produce a lot of quality nectar and pollen. And if you do that within a community, within your neighborhood association, it really sort of builds that whole big, larger, more robust system for the pollinators. And this is what I'm really encouraging, is we work with our city and county officials to look at how we're managing our public lands at the county level, at the city level, to say, can we have some of those spaces associated for, dedicated for pollinators and for native plants? Can we manage our roadsides in US, and our state Department of Transportation is doing a pretty good job trying to incorporate pollinator management into roadside management. I want to commend the governor. The governor's grounds, they have really converted those into a pollinator paradise. They have a variety of plants that bloom spring through fall. Some of the legislators grumble because it's not that green monoculture lawn they wanted, but from a bee enthusiast, when you walk around it, you see really what can happen when you put energy into supporting the native community. I think there's a lot of work to be done with our state agencies like state parks and fish and wildlife to have them recognize the need for managing our public lands with at least some emphasis on pollinator conservation. So sort of to wrap this up, and this went fairly quickly, so I'm hoping we'll have some good questions and discussions. I'm hoping that you'll walk away having a better respect for the value that bumblebees and other pollinators bring to our community, to our natural system. One thing I would really urge, and the folks that you're tuning into this are probably already doing this, spend time outside, appreciate the natural world. The diversity we have is pretty amazing. Notice bumblebees, take a list, take photographs. If you use my website to figure out what they are, build your own life list. Start being a citizen scientist and submitting your photos to other people like Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist, so we can capture that. Citizen science is so powerful. We can put so many more people resources in the field looking than state agencies or academicians or nonprofits can with paid staff. That citizen science is what we need to be all participating in. I'm really hoping that based on this talk and the values you already have, you'll start thinking more about making a personal commitment to pollinator protection. Plant a garden, speak up for the need for pollinators, ask our local, state, and federal officials to do more for native pollinators, put it on their radar screen. It's an easy ask for them to do for the most part. And it's a really feel-good thing for them to be able to embrace and ask and make changes to do. I want to thank you very much for participating, for listening, and I'm happy to answer any and all questions you have. Hope you enjoyed it. If not, hope you enjoyed it. That's a joke. Going back to the earlier slide, and I'll just stop here and see how I can respond to any questions that I've helped you generate.
Thank you, David. That was amazing. The website, how helpful. And you said that you can access that on a smartphone. So you could be out in the field and you could have that on your phone and look up the bees, right?
Right. So 2 ways to do that. One is absolutely on your smartphone when you have internet service. And the one page called a dichotomous key will actually have all the questions you have to answer you have to ask yourself to get to the species. So you can actually just capture that one page as a static page on your website. So even when you don't have internet, you'd still have a resource to help you do that identification. Nice.
That is so great. And you developed that yourself, the website?
Yes.
That was amazing. Wow. What a lot of work.
It's funny because I did that. It was actually a fair amount of fun and helped me learn a lot about how to tell them apart, from a very clear what are the rules to do that perspective. But that success often leads to more headaches. So now I've been asked to take the lead on developing a similar site for all the native bees of Washington, which is a much bigger endeavor because we have over 600 of those species.
Oh my gosh, that is fabulous. Do you want to stop sharing the screen and we can you see the questions in the chat box? To see the first one is what is the black shiny hump on the thorax?
I can show a picture of that if
Okay. Yeah. Can't see that.
So if you're talking about the black area on the top, yes.
There.
So I see, I can see that.
Okay.
And we saw that in a couple, like for example, the Nevada bumblebee had that big black spot. The thought is that helps the bees warm up more quickly because black absorbs light better than light colors. And their thorax is where they have their wing muscles and most of what's their muscles are using to get warm. So I think the thought is that black area helps them be ready to fly earlier in the morning. Let me just pause and go off on the side. There's a lot of competition for that nectar and pollen resource. We don't really appreciate it. Well, I've got some friends who are pollination ecologists, and the literature points out that the plants within a group of the same species, there's a lot of decision, these are like not decision making, but evolutionary strategies that are being played out, where some individuals will produce a lot of pollen and a lot of nectar to make sure that the bees come. And another individual plant will be like, well, I look like you, and he'll just come to me thinking that it's going to be that I'll also have a lot of nectar and pollen, but I'm not going to have a lot of nectar because that's pretty expensive to produce, but he'll just get my pollen and leave. And then if there's too many of those, then the bees will say, well, this isn't very productive. I'm not going to use this species. So there's this, this interaction between plants and pollinators about, is it worth me coming to you? So it's not so for the most part, in a healthy, full system, there are no free lunches. All that nectar is being used by somebody. The bees, the butterflies, the beetles, the wasps. And the bees are actually deliberate. So I'm going to the next question. The bees deliberately collect the pollen because they're collecting that pollen on their legs in the pollen basket because they take that back with nectar that they've put in their stomach. come back to the colony and then mix it together in sort of a soft mash, and that's what they feed their young. So that's why they're going from flower to flower to collect pollen, and so they can use that to feed their young. And so it's not at all accidental. The pollen is very deliberate. It's accidental for almost all the other pollinators because they're not using that as a food source for the young. That's why the bees are so much better at pollination from a plant perspective. Also, the fact that they go to the same flower species over and over because they've learned how to be efficient at unlocking the secrets of that flower. So again, native bees and plants have had this dance for millions of years about how to be effective with each, how does each one get what it needs from the other. And from a plant perspective, what they don't want is some interloper, some fly by night showing up, some butterfly that's going to drink all the pollen, drink all the nectar, not pick up the pollen and fly away. What they want is to make sure that their pollen gets collected and taken to a different species, a different individual flower. And so a fair number of species of plants require something called buzz pollination. And you can look it up on YouTube and see videos of it. But the bee, the bumblebee, will grab this stamen of the flower and vibrate her wings at a certain frequency. And when she does that, that frequency then makes all the pollen release from the stamen and fall onto her to collect it. And what that really means is somebody else can't come and steal that pollen unless they know how to do buzz pollination. Honeybees don't do that, as an example. So that buzz pollination is an example of the coevolution that's happened between some plants, species, and bumblebees. Next question. And I'm happy to, people can jump in and ask for clarification or whatever. The next question is a good camera to photograph. So what I use actually is a digital SLR. It's a Nikon 7100. What I've really come to appreciate about the digital model, I started in the day where you bought rolls of film of 12, 24, or 36, and then had to pay for them to get it developed afterwards and mailed to you or whatever. With the digital cameras, you can take hundreds of pictures. In a good day in the field, I might come back with 1,500 or 2,000 that I have to wade through, but you can capture them quickly. And also you can set the camera up so that you can tell it to be, in my case, a depth of field of f8. So it's a fairly good depth of field, a shutter speed of 1/1600th of a second, 1/1600. And then the camera and the flash can figure out how much light it needs to have to get it at that level, or what the ISO or the sensitivity needs to be to capture the image. So the digital SLR is really helpful these days for me. The other is I use a macro lens. I've got a 200 macros that I got actually as a wedding present 30 years ago. Yeah, time flies, doesn't it? That I still use. And I have a little shoulder mount that to hold it secure. So that's pretty elaborate for most people. What I find does work in a lot of cases is using the iPhone. And if you can get it to focus, you shoot a video of the bee. And then you can look at the individual pictures that make up that video and find 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 that show the field characteristics you need to look at. I don't have a good list of bumblebees found in the Met Towel, although I think, and I did get forwarded an email of someone who has a checklist and a sort of a key to the bumblebees of the Met Towel. And I don't know if you're on or not, but if you are, feel free to let us know about it. I'm going to take the next 2 questions together, the artificial nest setups and what does a bumblebee nest look like. Different species, and I'll answer the second question first. Different species have different nesting habits. The majority of species put a nest use like an abandoned rodent burrow or some sort of area underground that they'll put their colony in. Other species will take advantage of like abandoned bird houses with little openings that they can use, holes in trees, holes. I know that on the west side we get Melanopygus, which is the red black-tailed bumblebee. They often nest around people's homes. So for the most part, bumblebee nests are hard to find and because they're underground. This time of year, you'll see the queens when they're not foraging for food, often flying like this a couple of inches above the ground. And what they're doing is they're looking for a hole that they can go explore for their nest site. You can take advantage of that to have them potentially use an artificial nest site. You can go on the internet to find plans to build your own. There are a couple places, there's one over in Spokane that will build bumblebee nest boxes that you can order. If you just put them out, they have a really low chance of getting used because depending on where you are, the bees will find sort of more natural sites. But a trick that I plan to try, I haven't tried it yet, but somebody was telling about it and it makes great sense to me, is if you have your artificial bumblebee nest box ready this time of year when the queens are just now coming out, later in the afternoon when they've had a chance to feed, because you want them to have a chance to feed so they have new resources after being asleep all winter. You capture them, you get them cold. They don't get hurt by being made cold, but they slow down. So you put them on ice for half an hour or 15 minutes to get them really slow. And then you put them into that nest box. So when they come to, they may wake up and say, oh, I'm not sure how I got here, but it's secure. It's got nest materials. It looks pretty good. Here's an opening. When they leave, they may well end up coming back to it because they can't find something better. So you're sort of helping to introduce them to your artificial nest box, if that makes sense. And John Colts has added, he does have a Methow list available and he has pictures of each one of them. So that would be a really nice resource to have at the local level.
Yeah, in fact, if he wants to send that, John, if you want to send that list to me at manager@medhowathome.org, I could send that out to everybody.
And I see based on my computer time that it's now 11 o'clock. So I'm happy to answer as many questions as you have, but I also don't want to overstay my welcome.
Yeah. Anybody else want to say anything? Have any other questions? We sure appreciate you doing this. It's fascinating.
Well, I appreciate all of you tuning in and listening. The more people who understand the value of pollinators and the need to protect them, the better off we're going to be, because as a conservationist, as someone who understands, I've been studying wildlife ecology since I was in my teens. It's a really scary time right now.
Yeah, I know.
So the more we could all be participate, be part of the solution, the better. So again, I don't mean to get morbid. Just want to say thank you guys and really think about planting a pollinator garden.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And thank you, David. Have a wonderful day and go plant some flowers.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.